Welcome to the Monocle Banking Podcast. Today we've got a very special guest with us, Dr. Michael Power. Dr. Power's had a distinguished career as the Global Strategist at 91. He has extensive experience working with prominent institutions, Anglo-American, Rothschild, HSBC, Equator and Barings. He holds a PhD from the University of Cape Town, a Master's from the Fletcher School at Tufts and a Bachelor's from Oxford. Currently, his primary focus is researching geoeconomics, particularly the global implications of the return of the economic centre of gravity to a more China-centred Asia. And today we're going to be unpacking some hard truths, I think, that are starting to come home to roost on the global economy. Now, many critics argue that Francis Fukuyama was naive at best, foolish at worst, when he published his End of History treatise. The end of the Cold War was supposed to usher in a better world. After 4 decades of struggle, the great battle between the isms, liberalism and Bolshevism, had ended in the former's decisive victory, and I think many in the West hoped that liberalism would now have free rein to shape events around the world. Utopia, at least of a liberal form, was finally within humanity's grasp. And we look today at the world, and I don't think anything could be further from the truth. Debt burdens have grown so large that governments now owe an unprecedented $91 trillion, an amount almost equal to the total size of the global economy, and 1/3 of that is at the door of the US at the moment. Michael, welcome to the podcast. It really does feel like we are living in a period of time that will define the next era or the next epoch, so to speak. Firstly, you foresee a global crisis unfolding over the next few years when financial disruption is just one aspect of that. Could you just elaborate on the primary factors driving this impending crisis?
The term that's being used, and thank you very much, Michael, it's nice to speak with you again. The term that's being used at the moment is something called Polycrisis, which is essentially a crisis that happens across a wide range of area: politics, economics, geoeconomics, geopolitics, which are indeed different subjects. And then I think probably one cannot forget the environment. And they tend to feed off each other, even though they might not be specifically connected to each other. But once one of them starts to go, others sort of kick in. And I think that there are many areas where the problem might start. They don't necessarily have to start, say, for instance, with US debt, although I regard that as probably the most precarious of all major issues in the world today. But it could start as the Great Depression of the 1930s, started with the bankruptcy of a relatively small bank in Austria called Kreditanstalt. So we have to be aware that the connectedness, and I think that it's interesting now that the BIS, rather than ranking banks according to their being too big to fail, now have a new categorization, which is that they're too connected to fail. And that, I think, is indicative of what we're talking about here. The connectedness of all of these possible precarious events would essentially morph into a single polycrisis. And that's something which I think there are a number of very serious thinkers now starting to worry about. And I particularly refer to a guy called Tooze, who's writing some amazing stuff on his Substack.
Adam Tooze, he really is at the forefront of this. Now, you mentioned the extraordinary amounts of debt both in the West and the East as a central fault line. How did we arrive at such unsustainable debt levels, and what are the historical precedents that might help us understand the size of the current predicament that we're facing?
Well, without wanting to let the Chinese off the hook, because they've got their own hook to deal with, they are very different, in large part, forms of debt that East and West has. In the West, essentially, it's the detritus that's been left over from uber Keynesianism in the American style, where governments have spent more than they've earned for a long period of time, run up deficits, and those deficits have continued to grow, and therefore debt to GDPs have continued to grow. And for 6 of the G7, Germany accepted now, they've all got debt to GDP over 100%. Japan is well known around 256%. So I think it's this leftover debt from decades of essentially thinking that you can, sweep the problem under the carpet, which from year to year you probably can. But the cumulative effect of this is to end up with an enormous amount of debt. And I mean, it's really started to explode in the United States, which has gone from 8 trillion 2008 beginning of to around 35 trillion today. Almost worse than that has been the amount of interest that they're paying on that debt, which since 2021 January has gone from 500 billion to about 1.1 trillion today. So in the last 3 years, it's more than doubled in terms of interest being paid on that debt. Niall Ferguson, another guy who's starting to ring the alarm bells, formulated an idea last year that, and he goes back through history to prove that this has been the case, whenever a great power starts to pay more interest on its debt than it's paying on its defense budget, it won't remain a great power for much longer. And interestingly, in the last 6 months, the United States has crossed that Tiber, and we now see that they're paying about 200 billion a year more on their interest bill than they are on their defense bill, which, by the way, is no mean bill. It's 40% of all the defense budgets in the world and more than the next 8 countries put together.
That is frightening. Where do you trace back the root cause to this? Interesting that when one goes back in history, you look at Charles de Gaulle rolling his ships in asking for his gold and the depegging of the dollar to the gold standard. That a lot of people who are looking at alternatives like cryptocurrencies and even gold again really point to that as one of the key turning points that has really undermined and eroded the confidence in the global financial system and in fiat currencies, and this ability for the US dollar to, through its primacy, just be printed almost at will, and has led to this crisis today.
I think that's absolutely right. Of course, you can trace it earlier than 1971, when Nixon essentially started to abandon the gold standard in the series of moves which were complete by 1973. But it really was as a result of the not guns or butter policies of Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s, but the guns and butter policies. So the Great Society program, which was the social program that the Americans ran out at that time, was coupled with the enormous expense that was now being directed towards financing the Vietnam War. And this combination meant the US started running quite serious deficits at that point, at least by comparison to history. They're much more serious now, and running structural current account deficits. The result was, and your point is absolutely right, that the only way they could pay for these was by printing money, or indeed issuing bonds, which is almost the same thing in this context, and getting the kindness of foreign strangers to essentially lend money to the United States, which they've been doing in progressively larger and larger amounts ever since. And it's now about 60% of the world's mobile savings. And this is a statistic that needs repeating. 60% of the world's mobile savings are currently going towards the United States to cover its current account deficit. And of those savings, about 92%, at least last year, went into the US bond market, i.e. to help fund that deficit. So it's becoming a very precarious situation because of the sheer large numbers that we're dealing with here.
What is the upshot given the politics? Now, this is where it really gets interesting, because you talk of the Polycrisis. The politics has been one of, certainly in the West, a feeling that globalization hasn't served traditional conservative support bases who have felt that the natural reordering of the world, which I think was best illustrated through the Branko-Milanovic elephant graph, that showed rising incomes in large part in China and to some extent in India and elsewhere of the lower to upper middle income stratas of society, starting to balance out more with the established Western middle classes. There was a feeling that globalization, at least leveling the playing field somewhat, wasn't really panning out for those in the West. And so we've seen a rise of a more populist leader who's kind of tapped into that fear. And certainly if you look at Trump as an example of this, the Trump trade is one of, well, we'll spend more, we'll tax less. In an environment where we're talking about US fiscal policy that's hardly been profligate, how do you see this ending?
Well, I think it'll come to a point where the rest of the world will eventually say enough's enough and we really can't finance your deficit any longer, not to this degree anyway. And there'll be a sort of buyer's strike of US bonds, which obviously will then start to see, unless the Fed steps in, as the Bank of Japan did in Japan, and starts buying up those bonds, which is always a possibility. But that then means pure monetization is going on, which is a very dangerous stage to reach. We're going to see a situation where foreigners are going to start backing away. Everyone always always thinks that foreigners put their money in America so that it can go into its wonderful stock exchange. Well, they do put a little bit in, but it really is quite a little bit. As I said, 92% go toward the bond market.
Yeah.
So, the fact of the matter is that if they start to back away from the bond market and rates start to rise, I don't know what that'll do to the stock market. I don't know what that'll do to the property market in the United States, but it probably won't be good. And that's just showing you how the connectedness of all of this will start to play out. And I think then your earlier point is that people will be casting around for all sorts of alternative assets, some traditional, some not so traditional, in which to store their money. Because I think at that particular point, we shall start to remember the first rule of investing. And the first rule of investing is always don't lose money for your clients or for yourself.
Yeah.
And the second rule is once you've done rule number one, you move on to rule number two, which is to make money. But don't forget rule number one. And I think a lot of people are going to start to be reminded of rule number one in the next few years.
And we're having this conversation, interestingly, Michael, as we've just seen gold touch a new all-time high. There are a number of reasons, and primary is the one that you've just mentioned, that people might be looking for alternatives to hedge against this. But what we've also seen, and I think quite interestingly, the World Gold Council has picked up, at least for the last 18 months, central bank buying of gold, in particular China, Turkey, India, and some more traditional central bank buyers. But it's been a trend ever since the dollar was weaponized against Russia when it invaded Ukraine, when Russia's foreign holdings were frozen. And there was this talk then, specifically amongst China and those allied to Russia at a geopolitical level, of creating an alternative to the dollar hegemony that we're seeing in the world. Do you think that's in part driving what we've seen in the gold price at the moment?
I think it is. I think the central banks of Asia in particular, but it's not just, as you noted, those of Asia are starting to hedge their bets against the dollar because they potentially do see this problem arising in the not too distant future. So I do think that we're going to see not just central banks, but other people as well start to look for assets. And I think, central banks are probably not going to hedge in cryptos, but private individuals might, for whatever you might think about cryptocurrencies. And I'm still not yet convinced. I do think that people are going to start to look for these alternatives. The other alternative, which hasn't really been picked up to the same degree, is that the Chinese in particular have been buying enormous amounts of commodities to put into their strategic reserve. I mean, to some extent, the liquidation of the strategic oil reserve in the United States has reappeared in the Chinese strategic oil reserve. China owns probably over half, and it depends on which one you look at, of the world's grain reserves, whether it's barley or wheat or corn or whatever, or soya. And that's another way. I mean, the interesting thing is the IMF doesn't require them to add those numbers to their foreign exchange reserves, but to all intents and purposes, they are foreign exchange reserves, just held in a form that isn't recognized by the IMF.
Yeah.
So I think what we're seeing at the moment is this massive shift. It's slow, it's bitty, it's not in a one straight line direction. But when you stand back and look at it over a 3-year period, as you're talking about essentially with the gold price, yes, it is in a quite obvious new direction that we're now seeing prices for assets like that going.
Given that then, I mean, if we're witnessing the reorientation of the global financial order with the US losing its undisputed position at the center, what do you envision as the new structure of a new multipolar financial world, and how do you see Asia, particularly China, playing a role in that?
Well, look, first of all, I must say that I'm not one of these people who believes, and most of the defenders of the dollar will stand up immediately and say, oh, but what else can there be? You mean the renminbi? It doesn't mean that we immediately see, everything switching from dollars to renminbi. We're going to go into a fragmented, messy environment for currencies, for asset classes, where there'll be no single dominant alternative to the dollar, but there'll be a multitude. And yes, China will be a big noise in that. I have no doubt whatsoever. They'll probably be the biggest noise in that, but they won't be the only noise in that. And so we're seeing, for instance, the UAE and India now trading oil in dirhams. So we are seeing alternatives starting to creep into the system, other ways of doing it. And I think that these will just multiply to an extraordinary degree if there is a serious event that starts seeing the rest of the world starting to question whether they should be sending 60% of their annual mobile savings to the United States to help them fund their deficit. Especially if, dare I say it, there's a Donald Trump who wants to cut taxes, and probably not, let's be fair, looking on the performance of the 2016 to 2020 period, remembering, of course, COVID came at the end of it, he wasn't cutting back on expenditure either. He did both. He cut taxes and increased expenditure. I think that the rest of the world is going to say, hang on a second, the emperor has got some fairly threadbare clothes on, and we need to start hedging ourselves to a greater degree than we've done in the past. I think some people are already doing it.
Certainly looks that way in the market. The concept of the Ouroboros, the snake eating its tail, certainly almost springs to mind here when you describe that kind of policy in an environment where neither party in the US wants to deal with the other big issue in the US, and that's how do you fund unfunded benefits into the future in an environment where no one wants to raise taxes, no one wants to cut back on expenditure. It's just kicking the can down the road, deferring very difficult, politically difficult decisions in an environment where, if you look at the current divide in the US, the political instability, the attempted assassination of former President Trump, it seems an extremely volatile country at the moment. How do you foresee this impacting American politics, to go into that space for a while as we build up to that?
You earlier mentioned how, things had essentially going back to the famous elephant curve. What we saw is that with China in particular arriving on the world scene, it's now been joined by a host of other imitators in Southeast Asia and even to some degree India. They basically undermined much of the industrial base of the West, starting with the United States and spreading to Europe. There are parts of Europe that are still, hanging in there, like Germany and Austria and the Netherlands, but it is spreading. And the result is that you've got in those societies, everybody had the opportunity to buy seemingly very cheap Chinese goods. I always use the Chinese formula was, I'll give you 90% of the quality at 60% of the price. They're now giving you at 110% of the quality at 60% of the price, which is a really awful combination for a competitor in the West, which is why they're having to slam tariffs on EVs and solar panels and the rest, because the Chinese EVs and the Chinese solar panels are better than those that are broadly speaking found in the West. The latest BYD car, which is, I think, $11,000 will give you a 2,000 kilometer range. This is not something the West can compete with. So they were able to buy cheap goods on the one hand, but of course in the process they lost their jobs in the other hand. And so you ended up with this sort of subgroup of people, and they were not a small number. And I always call them both left behinds and the never caught ups. And they grew larger and larger, and they very much define a lot of the politics, not just in the United States, what's happened in France, what's happened in Britain to a greater or lesser degree. And this is what Western democracies, liberal democracies, are having to contend with at the moment, that, the vast majority of their relatively lower wage sort of citizens are finding it difficult to find meaningful jobs where they can grow their income from one year to the next. And I think it's that. And just speaking of politics in the United States, no person wrote this more beautifully, I have to say, and indeed more sadly, than J.D. Vance in his book, The Hillbilly Elegy, which completely exposes what happened in Middle America and how vast swathes of people who'd previously had half-decent blue-collar jobs suddenly found themselves without jobs.
Yeah.
And I think that is exactly playing into the political story that we're seeing, particularly in the United States, but not just the United States.
Yeah, and I know that Steve Bannon has also highlighted this as a key driver behind what we might term right-wing populism. They see it more as a very bread and butter response to those exact issues of feeling like your job security has been taken, your way of life and your very identity are under threat. And so little wonder that we see, ever since the global financial crisis, it didn't lead to a resurgence of left-wing politics, but rather to a rise in more right-wing populism. And back to what Fukuyama was saying, he was arguing that economic disruptions often lead to a backlash against policies perceived to prioritize minorities and immigrants, and that fuels a lot of nationalist sentiment. How do you see this being resolved in an environment where the response so far has been to raise tariff barriers, to raise walls, to say, well, if the Chinese are making such good quality EVs, what we're going to do in Europe and the US is we're just going to slap tariffs on them to protect our local industries. Surely this then just fans the inflationary flames that we've been seeing rip across the world and keeps interest rates higher for longer and makes that debt more difficult to service.
All of that, absolutely. And I think that's one of the reasons why debt service costs in the West have just gone up fairly dramatically. Obviously, there was an attempt attempt to try and wring inflation out of the system, which slowly but surely it seems to be happening. But if for whatever reason the trade wars come back with a vengeance, and one thing they all say about J.D. Vance is that he prioritizes China as enemy number one, not just militarily, but in terms of economically, then the chances are that we're going to start to see prices rising again. And that would really, just start squeezing the system from within and from without. I don't see an easy way out. I don't see a particular solution. I think China will basically try and do what it can for as long as it can in terms of exporting goods to the West. But its way out, and it's not necessarily as healthy a way out, or at least a profitable a way out, but nevertheless it's starting to show up fairly big in the figures, is that they are now exporting huge amounts of product to the non-Western part of the world. And I always like the fact that in, for instance, wind turbines, which is something where China has a real hold now. The top 5 countries that were exported to last year, none of them were in the West. In fact, number 3 was South Africa. So the fact is that they're discovering, and you can see it in the data, they're discovering other parts of the world that actually are now, they do amount to a row of beans, and you can export to them. And it's not just being solely dependent on the Western consumer.
But that came through in conversations I had with the CEO of Bidvest and Pumi Madisa recently, who said they were caught flat-footed by the Chinese OEMs and just how quickly they entered the South African market. If you look at the brands, the Beijings and the Cherry and the Tigo and the smartphone manufacturers, Honor and Huawei and all the others that have come in, to your earlier point, at quality levels that can now compete globally at much lower costs. And so it does look like an industrial strategy that is only set to take root and grow, given that. But this is also happening, Michael, at a time when the Chinese economy isn't in a great space. We just recently had the most recent GDP figure out. It was a slight miss. We've got the third plenum, which is a very closely guarded kind of policy conference for the Chinese Communist Party taking place at the Jingxi Hotel. It's best known for its homemade yogurt, but the Chinese economy is turning sour again.
And look, the Chinese economy is not going to grow as fast as it did. And to be honest, much of the first 20 years of this century, the growth was built on the back of a huge amount of property development. I mean, 600 million people moved off the land and into the cities in that 20-year period. So they basically had to build rather a lot of property to accommodate them. Now, that degree of urban migration has lessened substantially. So they're not having to build. And in fact, they've overbuilt in any case. So there's something to absorb even with those that are still coming in. So suddenly that driver is no longer there. I think what we're seeing in China is what I see the emergence of what I call China 2.0. China 1.0, which was really starting in the 1990s and then really got its sort of running shoes on after China went into the WTO in 2001, was built on the back of cheap labor. And the products they produced, the textiles, the shoes, the furniture, all of those sorts of traditional areas, many of those are now migrating to Southeast Asia because China can no longer make them particularly productively or profitably. But that was China 1.0. China 2.0 is something very different. And that's only coming out now. And I think to some extent it was developed under what I call cover of COVID. And that is something which combines the fact that they have got unbelievably, compared to their competitors, cheap energy inputs because the Russians are selling them their energy, coal, oil, gas at 30 or 40% lower than the world prices because of the sweet deal that basically Xi Jinping's negotiated with Putin. That's the one thing. And having a cheap energy source is almost enough in and of itself. But the second thing is that the enormous amount of automation that's taking place in China. So essentially capital improvement. China is installing automation machines at the moment at a rate that's more than the rest of the world put together in a given year. And so you've got this extraordinary machine that's beginning to emerge that's, not always automated. Of course, it's not always automated, but it's substantially automated and it's running on cheap energy. That's a really powerful combination. And the West is only just waking up to it now that's what China is about looking forward. To be honest, I'm not surprised. I mean, obviously, there's a big part of me that doesn't like the idea that tariffs are going to have to come in to stop this tsunami of goods coming. But that's what's probably going to have to happen. Politics will demand it.
And also, to a certain extent, just ensuring that there's a level playing field. For example, the likes of Temu and Shein, who've come in and exploited the de minimis rule and certain other loopholes to import landed goods at far lower costs than other providers can, because they're not paying a similar tax, for example, at the ports and at customs. Just make sure that the playing fields are level. But For South Africa, given we're seeing this reorientation, and in the spirit of the government of national unity, we're now sending a delegation to the US to persuade them to not review our AGOA status and that kind of thing, yet we want to be non-aligned, and so we've got our friends in BRICS Plus. How should South Africa be playing this reorientation?
Look, it's not easy. I don't envy any country in the so-called global south trying to steer a middle path between, the rise of the East and the still very powerful position of the West. The West, of course, controls things like the IMF and the World Bank and the rest of it. So, to the extent that there are debt negotiations, say, for instance, in Zambia, although the Chinese are huge owners of debt in Zambia, and that has really upset the apple cart to some extent. But the IMF is still, in Kenya, the IMF is calling the shots there. And I think that's the problem that countries in the middle, South Africa is not overly exposed to the IMF at the moment, but still to some extent has to play lip service. And they're going to have to try and find a path. I think what's going to happen is that we're all going to have to sort of muddle through, but realize that slowly but surely China's not going to go away. And the goods that we need, the wind turbines I mentioned just now, or the solar panels, you've probably seen some of the stats on the solar panel imports into South Africa. They've been off the charts for the last 3 years. I hear that they're basically the equivalent of level 6 in load shedding now, that we have the capacity to generate in terms of power from our solar panels. So I think that that's where the stuff is going to come from. Now, we might here and there put our own tariffs, and that has indeed started to be talked about in the likes of Mexico, likes of Brazil, likes of South Africa, especially India, but that's perhaps for some other reasons. And I think there will be a little bit of tariff behavior as many sort of southern countries try to protect what little industry they've still got. But generally speaking, they're probably going to capitulate and say, well, we still need the stuff and, we're not producing it ourselves. So I think that's where things are going to go. You don't want to end up with this over-dependency on suppliers out of the East, but I think that's where things are traveling, simply because they are producing not just the cheapest, but the best.
And to some extent, the world was quite happy with that for a period. Chinese exported deflation around the world. And when it became apparent that this was wreaking the havoc that you mentioned around the industrial base in the West, that's when, the conversation started. But I think as South Africa, as a country, for us to, for example, put a 10% tariff on solar panels, when the net benefit to a country struggling with an energy crisis is the ability to do away with load shedding, seems to be pure madness. We're just not balancing the trade-offs here. It's far more important that we have overall for this economy cheap power. There may be supporting one very niche industry and maybe a couple of thousand, maybe even 10,000 jobs at max. So it's about priorities at the same time, surely, Michael. Now, just lastly, if you're looking at this as a researcher, as someone who's got deep interest in geoeconomics, what areas do you believe require more research, more focus and understanding in the context of these global economic shifts to help guide us, to help prepare individuals and investors for a very tumultuous new period?
Well, look, it's obviously slightly different for the individual as it is for the nation. On the nation, I'll just put up front, I think one of the things that's going to rather surprise us is the re-emergence of the Indian Ocean trading basin, which before Vasco da Gama so rudely interrupted it was the most vibrant trading basin on the planet. And I think that there is an interesting collection of countries. Most people don't really look at it that way, but from South Africa through the Middle East, through to the Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia, Indonesia, and Australia, it's quite an interesting collection of countries that can bring rather a lot to the table. And there's complementarity between their various skills and labor and resources and money and the like. And I think that that's going to be one thing that's going to happen. And I think the nations of the Indian Ocean Basin are going to, partly because China won't be, or indeed most of the West, a member of the club. I think that's something which you're going to see happening over the next 10 years, with some parts of the region moving more quickly than others. On an individual basis, I think we're going to have to remember capital preservation. And people ask me, so what should I be doing at the moment? And it's not an easy answer, but the number one thing I say is pay down debt, because I think that most people don't regard that as an investment decision, but it is an investment decision. You're probably taking cash and paying down debt. The reason why I say is I can't see us going through this polycrisis without interest rates being affected in the sense that they're going to go up. And so if you do have debt, it will start to strangle you. So get into a position where you can give yourself maximum flexibility ahead of this coming polycrisis. And I can't think of one piece of advice. If I'm only allowed one piece of advice, pay down debt.
Yeah, and it's the one that is guaranteed to give you a return above all else. Michael Power, thank you very much. Great insights that you shared with us today here on the Monocle Banking Podcast into the geo-economic lay of the land and the polycrisis that is starting to intersect at various fault lines across the global economy and its impacts on us here as a very small open economy on the southern tip of Africa. Appreciate your time.